Greetings and welcome to April 22nd. This is lecture 2, and we're going to continue on this conversation about ethical discourse. In the previous lecture, we explored how Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations shape a perspective or a view of how humanity lives in pursuit of the right, good, true, and noble. And in the lecture previous to that last week, we talked about how culture shapes our assumptions of ethical discourse, and I want to continue to make our way down this path in terms of how we understand ethical discourse to work and the frameworks that people seem to assume in their pursuit of the right, good, true, and noble, or how they understand the right, good, true, and noble to work across the social landscape. And so there's several that we're going to choose from, and this isn't a comprehensive list, but I think it's at least a helpful list to try to understand the different ways in which people have got to where they've arrived in terms of the decisions they make about ethical discourse. The first of which is what I want to suggest to you is found in a sort of Darwinianism or a social Darwinism. This is sort of an evolutionary model, and this is in some respects a little bit of what Haidt would suggest to us, is that humanity, by nature of its progressive experience of life and community, ultimately moves towards the right, good, true, and noble, because they understand that that's the way that humanity continues to exist on this earth. That if we were consistently making decisions that were disconnected to the right, good, true, and noble, then we would ultimately lead towards our own demise. So for example, a Darwinianist would suggest that the reason why that across cultures that we've understood that you ought not kill someone who is vulnerable or innocent is because that to do so would put humanity itself at peril. And so there's been this social Darwinianism that has sort of moved towards this idea of evolution, and the way in which we arrive at where we are in terms of the right, good, true, and noble is based upon humanity's desire to continue to flourish and exist well together. Now, there was this sort of progressivism that operated in the 18th and 19th century, this belief that we were just getting better at being human, until we hit the 20th century. And one of the challenges for this sort of social Darwinianism, or this progressive ideal, is that we killed more people in warfare in the 20th century than all centuries prior to combined. It's this recognition that humanity has this complete capacity to annihilate the right, good, true, and noble in pursuit of its own selfish, ambitious intents and desires, even under the auspice or the name of the right, good, and true, and noble. So we ought not suggest that things are just getting better. We ought to bridle that conversation about progressivism, suggesting that there is inherently within the human being the capacity to do great harm and great evil. And so that challenges this idea of social work Darwinianism. Then there is what we call behaviorism. This is how we sort of program the right, good, true, and noble into humanity, that we are sort of a blank slate on which behaviors are acted to make us be something different. So it's not really sort of an examined life in terms of, we look deep into trying to understand the philosophy of our ethical discourse and why we make the decisions in pursuit of the right, good, true, and noble that we do. Instead, that humanity is like one notch above animals, and we can be sort of programmed to act in certain ways that are beneficial for the survival of humanity. That this is about sort of behavioral engineering. That there's this idea of determinism, cause and effect, law-based. It's scientific causality that has shaped and formed us to be who we are in the ways in which we are afforded the opportunity to live. And there's this great quote: the ability to anticipate what individuals will do given certain circumstances leads to behaviorism, to conclude that we do not need the idea of a soul to explain what humans do. We don't need sort of an examined life to explore the depths of ethical discourse. What we do need to do is to identify what is harmful, what is hurtful, and then create a set of behaviors that leads people away from that sort of mindset. Then there's what's called egoism. And egoism is the belief that we are intentionally selfish and narcissistic at some level. And by that, what I mean is we are turned inward. That the right, good, and true, and noble is almost an illusion, because what we're really talking about is self-interest. There is no altruism. In fact, altruism would be a ridiculous idea according to egoism. Altruism would be a ridiculous idea. If we just all gave our stuff away for the sake of others, we'd have no stuff, and then we wouldn't survive well. In fact, the reason why we don't do certain things to others is because we don't want those things to happen to us. And we have a self-interest in when we do good deeds. It's because we want that to reflect back upon us so that we can actually thrive. And the suggestion in egoism is that we actually do much better when we're all living according to our selfish ideals, because we talk in terms of then self-preservation, and we're not sacrificing for the ultimate good. We're actually taking care of self, and by taking care of self, we recognize the responsibility to not harm the other selves who could ultimately end up doing us harm. And so egoism operates as a conceptual framework for moral discourse as well. And then there's what's called utilitarianism. And so it wants to hold on to the autonomous rationality, the ability for a human being to reason their way into the good, while at the same time avoiding the selfishness that is explicit in sort of an egoism. So humanity has the capacity as an individual to make reasonable decisions about what is right, good, true, and noble, oftentimes for themselves, but it doesn't want to do that in the same way as sort of egoism, where it's all turned inward. In fact, the contrary is true. In fact, utilitarianism is about maximizing the greatest amount of happiness and flourishing for the most amount of people in the pursuit of the good life as possible. So we want to make decisions that are best for the most at any given situation. So in essence, ethics can be turned into arithmetic. Like, you do the math, which is most beneficial for the most amount of people. The challenge with that is, and the suggestion I think we need to recognize in that is, that it's oftentimes the people on the margins of the periphery that get put to the side in terms of utilitarianism, because they're not the majority, and so we don't look to their interests, because to look to their interests would cost this group of people. And we're seeing that in some regards in terms of the ethical discourse regarding the COVID-19 crisis, because people are trying to ask the question, what's going to do more harm over the long haul? The close down of the economy, that's a utilitarianistic idea, this pragmatic approach, or is it going to be caring for the most vulnerable parts of our community, more broadly speaking, in terms of our sick and those who, like the elderly, who seem to be affected at disproportionate levels by means of the COVID crisis. And so I want to suggest those two things in terms of their relationship with one another. Also, I want to suggest another way of viewing this is what's called deontological ethics. This is an approach talked about by Immanuel Kant, who evaluates actions by asking whether this action was the right thing to do according to a rule, not necessarily based upon what the outcome to that action was. So we don't make decisions based upon what the outcome should be. We should make decisions based upon what the moral rightness of the action, regardless of the outcome. And the assumption is that once we arrive at this is the right decision regardless of the outcome, that this decision needs to be right universally for all people at all times, no matter where you are, no matter what culture you believe in, and no matter what moral foundation, now he wouldn't have used that language, but whatever moral foundation you assume, is that deontological ethics is sort of an assumption that we can arrive at the right thing to do through reason, regardless of the outcome that emerges from that decision. And then there's what's called virtue ethics. This wants to ask the question, what kind of person ought I be? So instead of starting with the assumption of action, it starts with the assumption of virtue and character. And so it wants to say, what kind of person ought I be in this world? And the person that I ought to be in this world should inform the very things that I do. Whereas situational ethics wants to start with the assumed action, what is happening in this world, and say, what ought I do if this happens? Well, the challenge with that is that our character and our moral discourse is always in flux. It's always dependent upon the situation we find ourselves in, where virtue wants to root that into the being of a person, and their doing flows from their being. And it's not that people in situational ethics aren't concerned with being, but they recognize they've got this realism that suggests that where virtue ethics might say, I want to be a nonviolent person, that I feel like being committed to nonviolence is a virtue that I want to to engage in, to live out, to believe that is most consistent with the flourishing of all humanity. And a situational ethicist will immediately ask, so if someone bursts in this room and tries to hurt someone, are you not going to act on their behalf? And that's a situational question. So virtue wants to suggest, with this is the kind of character I want to be, situational ethics wants to say, but what if? And so we need to understand these are the frameworks. So whether it's behaviorism, whether it's utilitarianism, egoism, whether it's Darwinianism, whether it's deontological, situational virtue, there are different moral frameworks that people approach when they move into a conversation about the right, good, true, and noble. On the back end of this, I would say this: I am one who's committed to virtue ethics because I believe that ultimately we are called into the likeness of Christ as Christians, and that likeness of Christ should shape everything that we do. Everything that proceeds comes from that, and that we ought to not move into sort of a pragmatism or utilitarianism that consistently sets Jesus aside in pursuit of other agendas and ambitions that might devalue the things that Jesus cared deeply about. And I also believe that when we live out this sort of character of Christ, we will know what to do and how to do what needs to be done when those things happen, instead of constantly trying to figure out what I would do if something happened. And so those are some of the things that I wanted to share right there at the end of this conversation about ethics.